Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us for our Trout in the Classroom presentation on predators and prey. I am Jan Nimick, Angler Education for the Western Region, and we are here today with Sadie and Aiden, a couple of our wildlife educators out of the Western Region, and looking forward to some time with you guys. Real quick, touch base on our eggs and what we've got going so far. It appears that we have had lots of hatching already happening. So after a few days, I feel like we went right into Elvin. So everybody should be kind of just moving forward with their eggs. Quick reminders, make sure everybody's staying in the dark as well as we're not feeding yet. So we want to wait until those Elvin kind of go into more of the fry stage where they lose all of that egg sac or egg yolk before we start feeding. Otherwise, it's just going to make the water funky. So, um, without further, we'll get started with our presentation here on predators and prey.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay, so today we're going to be starting with Trout in the Classroom 2025 for our presentation. So this presentation is going to focus on food and predators of trout. So today we're going to be talking about what a habitat is, and if you have been a part of any of our Know Your Nevadas, this is going to be very familiar to you. What is a food chain, food web, and trophic pyramid? Sources of food for our trout and predators of our trout. So, what is a habitat? So, we've all probably heard this word before, but can anyone write in the chat what they might think it is, a definition? So, I see a home for an animal, living place where an animal lives, and environments where an animal can survive, which these are all great definitions. So ours is going to be where an animal or plant lives naturally and can grow. So again, there are many different types of habitats. We have a lot even in the state of Nevada. We have our low desert, we have our montane forest, aquatic, which we're going to be focusing on today with our trout, and our pinyon pine forest. But all of these have the ability to sustain life, and that is due to these four factors. So to qualify as a habitat, we must have four things. And if all of these four requirements are not met, it is not considered a habitat. So can anyone throw in the chat at least one or all four if they think they know what a requirement for a habitat to be is? Okay, so most of you are kind of hitting it right on the nail. So our first one is going to be food. So I see a lot of you put food in the chat. So yes, for an area to be considered a habitat, there is going to have to be a food source. So all organisms need energy, energy to grow, stay healthy, move around, generate heat, whatever it is for their biological processes, they're going to need food. Water is the other big one. So every organism needs water. We cannot survive very long without it. Obviously, when we talk about desert versus aquatic, every organism has a different threshold for how much water they need, but we all need it in the end of the day. Shelter. So this one, not as many of you put, but we do need shelter to be considered a habitat. So whether that be to shield an organism from predation, so being hunted, or even the elements themselves, so storms, drastic changes in weather, whatnot. And lastly, space. So space is kind of an odd one to think about, but every animal needs room to grow, move around, migrate, reproduce, whatever it may be. So today we're going to be kind of focusing on, especially with trout, what they eat and also what eats them. We're going to be focusing on something called a food chain. So food chain is a chain of consumers. So when we talk about consumers, we're just talking about another animal or organism consuming another organism. Very simple in those terms. So we're going to start from the bottom of our chain. So at the bottom of our chain is going to be a primary producer. So primary producers are essentially in our aquatic ecosystem, they're going to be macrophytes as well as algae. So again, these can be plants if we're talking terrestrial, but it's anything that produces its own energy. So these do not consume something else to get their energy. They are going to be generating energy. So when we're talking about our macrophytes or our algae, we're talking about a process called photosynthesis. So we're taking light, so that sunlight we get every day, and we're converting it to our energy. And again, when I say energy in these terms, it's going to be something that an organism uses to grow and do all of its other biological functions. So then moving up our chain, we're going to have primary consumers. So these primary consumers are going to eat our primary producers. So they are the first chain link that is going to be consuming something else. So in our aquatic ecosystem, these are going to be things like frogs. Oh, wait. No, I'm sorry, my bad. They're going to be stoneflies, mayflies, and caddisflies. So very small little organisms that are going to be eating those plant material. And then if we go up another link, we're going to have something called secondary consumers. Secondary consumers are going to be our frogs, crayfish, and even small trout. So trout are opportunistic eaters. They're going to be eating anything they can. But when they're small, obviously they have to adjust their diet. So they'll eat anything smaller than them. So they're secondary consumers when they're really tiny. But as they get bigger, they're probably going to become a tertiary consumer or maybe even a quaternary consumer. So these are kind of our top of our food chain, our top dogs of the ecosystem, if you'd want to say. But these are going to be things like our larger, fully grown trout, otters, herons, maybe even us. So these are going to be the things that can eat everything else in that food chain. So before we get into a trophic pyramid, does anyone want to put in a chat maybe an example of a food chain they can think of? If you can just go up to maybe the secondary consumer, just to show me that you know what a food chain is. And I'll share a couple. So someone asked if the sun should be at the bottom of the food chain because plant uses photosynthesis. So sometimes I've seen where a sun is connected in the food chain, but we're just focusing on the organisms right now. So a sun is not a living thing. So I see someone put algae, and algae is eaten by a fish, which is eaten by a bigger fish, which is eaten by maybe something like a badger. And I think that's a great example. And then someone wrote flamingos eating shrimp. These are all good things. So again, just understanding that, again, larger organisms are going to be eating those smaller ones and energy is going to be transferred up the chain. So there are many different ways to kind of show what we just talked about within the food chain. But a trophic pyramid is going to be kind of more focusing on essentially that energy transfer. So when I keep talking about energy again, it's that ability to take what's consumed and perform biological functions. So at the bottom of the pyramid, we're going to see the most organisms. So primary producers. So if they have 10,000 organisms, again, they're going to be taking in all that sunlight, producing their own energy. But then when they're consumed, energy is going to be lost. And in that sense, because those organisms in that primary consumer level are using energy to forage, hunt, whatever it might be to get their food source. So they have to use energy to get it. So there's 10,000 organisms in that lowest trophic level. There's going to be 1,000 organisms if you go up to primary consumers, because again, that energy loss, you can't provide as much for that next level. And then if you go up to secondary consumers, you're going to see like 100 organisms. And then if you go all the way to the top with those tertiary and quaternary consumers, you're going to see the least amount of organisms, so 10. So if you think about it, especially if you're looking at that bear, and habitat or ecosystem is not going to be able to support a large numbers of bears, correct? Because they consume a lot of food. So they have to eat a lot of different things to be able to meet their energy requirement, because larger animals use up more energy. They have more biological functions than those simpler creatures. So essentially, it's all about how that energy is used. So again, less can be supported in an ecosystem. And then moving on to a food web, which is personally my favorite because I think it shows essentially it's more of a holistic view of an ecosystem versus a food chain. A food chain is perfect to show exactly what ate what. But if you think about even our trout here, trout don't eat just one thing, right? They're going to eat a lot of different things. So again, these food webs, it's a bunch of different food chains linked together. So they're just going to be showing you how complex an ecosystem might be. So again, that fox is not just going to eat a mouse. It might eat a rabbit, squirrel, or a mouse. And all of those things have the same food source. If you're looking at those primary consumers, they have plants as their food source. So again, just more of a holistic approach to our whole ecosystem. So if we're thinking about all these levels in a food chain, again, remember we have primary producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, so on and so forth. What do you guys think our trout are, our rainbow trout? And you guys can throw that in the chat. So I see a lot of primary consumers. I see a secondary consumers. So I think this is going to depend a little bit on stage of life, but by the time they are adult, they are going to be secondary consumers because they do consume smaller trout, and they're going to be consuming those crayfish and frogs. So they're going to be eating different things, and they might even move up to tertiary. So again, going to depend on their size, but they will eat anything smaller than them. So in terms of what consumer they are is going to be dependent on size. So primary consumer, they may be when they first start to eat all those tiny insects that we're going to be talking about very soon. And then they're going to move up the chain as they get bigger. So here's some things our trout eat. Does anyone recognize any of these if they want to put them into the chat? Just based on the picture. Okay, I see. Definitely some of you are noticing the leech for sure, and crayfish. So they're going to eat crustaceans. And yes, this picture is a crayfish, but yes, this whole group. We're going to eat snails, leeches, and worms, insects, and other fish. Again, anything that's probably smaller than a trout, they're going to try to eat. So we're going to be talking about their first food group, which is going to be insects. So when we're talking about the insects that trout eat, we're going to be focusing on a lot of these insects that go through these processes that I'm going to talk about now, and one of them is complete metamorphosis. So, complete metamorphosis. You're probably going to be most familiar with a butterfly. So, a butterfly goes through complete metamorphosis, and that's going to all happen on land. So, the trout's food source that goes through this is called a caddisfly. And this is going to be done mostly in the water, but we'll get into that specifically after this. So, um, complete metamorphosis is going to go through these stages. So, it's going to be born as an egg, it's going to be laid, and then as it hatches, it's going to enter this stage called a larva stage. So, as a larva, obviously, it's very exposed in the sense of it's very vulnerable to predation. So it's not, doesn't have a lot of means to defend itself. So it's going to consume a lot of food because it wants to get out of this stage. And it needs to consume a lot of food as well because it's going to use a lot of energy in this next stage of its life. So it's going to enter the pupa stage where it's going to go through a really big change. For a butterfly, if you've ever talked about it going into a chrysalis, this is going to be that point. So all the insects we're talking about today develop wings at this point and undergo a huge transformation where they're going to look completely different when they emerge. So again, collecting a lot of energy, entering this pupa stage, and then it's going to emerge as a fully grown adult. And obviously this cycle was showing a butterfly, so it emerges as a butterfly, but for different insects, it's going to emerge just as an adult. And that normally has the ability to fly. So when we're talking about our caddisflies, so caddisfly is a food source for our trout, and you're going to see a picture of a fully grown one very soon here, but they're going to be laid as eggs, and they're going to be laid near the water or in the water on a leaf or a rock, wherever their parent left them. And this is going to last for about 1 to 3 weeks. And then they are going to hatch, and we're going to go into that larva stage. So you can see here a picture, kind of ugly, but this is very vulnerable to predation. A trout would definitely eat this. So this is going to be for about a month to a full year, and they're going to be consuming all that food to get ready for their next phase of life. So they're going to enter that pupa stage. So it's not going to look quite like a butterfly here, but what they like to do is they will take different rocks and organic material, maybe even shells of other like crustacean like creatures, and they put them on their back, kind of like they stick them like glue. And if you ever see something that looks more like what's in that circle there, those like rocks that are really joined close together, and they tend to do this in groups too, so you might see a cluster like that on a rock. These are actually caddisflies inside, and they're undergoing that big transformation so they can turn into adults. So they are growing wings here. So they spend a lot of their life in water, but when going through their life cycle, then they are going to hatch. They're going to be an adult. So oftentimes for these types of organisms, this is the shortest part of their life. So it's going to hatch, and its main objective is to reproduce. It's not necessarily, this is not like us where we spend most of our life in adulthood. This is a very short span of its life. So this period here is going to be only a couple months for the caddisfly. But it's going to then start laying its eggs, and the cycle will begin all again. So again, life cycle is from the point it hatches or is born all the way till it dies, and then it just keeps going as the animals reproduce. So not all of the trout's insects that it eats undergo something called complete metamorphosis. They may undergo a process called incomplete metamorphosis. So incomplete metamorphosis is going to be for its food sources like dragonflies, damselflies, mayflies, and stoneflies. So a lot of the different insects it eats. And it's a lot like complete metamorphosis, except for the fact that there's a few just minor differences. So they're not going to necessarily ever be a larva. They're going to be something called a nymph. So they're going to look a little bit different. We'll see a picture very soon. But they don't undergo this drastic change in that pupa stage. They're going to molt. So that's kind of like if you think of a snake shedding its skin, kind of like that, or like cicadas dropping their exoskeleton. It's essentially just they're shedding that outer layer a couple times through their nymph stage. And this is allowing them to change more gradually instead of that drastic change. So again, egg, nymph, molt, and then into an adult. And then we're going to show you, just like we did with the caddisfly, in specific examples. So if you're looking at a mayfly, we have those eggs again. So starting at that same phase of life, then we're going to hatch and become a nymph. So that nymph, as you can see too, if you're ever looking in the river and you want to be able to identify your own macroinvertebrates, which is a mayfly, we're going to have 3 tails on those mayflies instead of 2 because they look a lot like stoneflies. But anyways, they're going to go through that molting process, which is going to allow them to slowly change into the adult. And mayflies are actually really interesting and unlike the other ones in the sense that their adult life is extremely short. They're not even going to be eating at this point. They only live for a couple days. Their whole purpose is to lay their eggs and begin the cycle again. So here's some pictures of what the trout eats that undergo incomplete metamorphosis. So you saw the mayfly already. Here's a dragonfly. You can see above, there's a picture of it as a nymph. Then below, we have a picture of the adult. We have our stonefly, and again, remember I said that looked a lot like the mayfly, but you see now that only has 2 tails on the end. And then lastly, we have our state insect, which is the big dancer damselfly. Okay, and then I'm going to pass it to my friend Sadie here, and she's going to continue the webinar.
All right, so we're going to move on to our fish. And if you guys remember, the fish are either our secondary or tertiary consumers, our fish being the trout. They mainly eat bugs like we just talked about, which are the primary consumers. But like we said, they can eat anything smaller than themselves, and they will eat anything smaller than themselves, which gives them a little bit of wiggle room as they grow to go from primary consumers all the way to tertiary, sometimes even quaternary consumers. So we're going to discuss some fish food. If you guys notice here, there's a bunch of different fish that our trout can eat. A few of them are really small, like the one in the bottom right corner, and then a few of them can get a little bit bigger. And again, that depends on what stage of life our trout are in. And can anyone discuss with your class if you like? Can you guess what fish that bottom right corner is? They're really, really small. But does anyone have any good guesses in the chat? Yeah, awesome. Those are really good guesses. Like I said, they are small. So tadpoles, crawdads, maybe, smaller fish, minnows. Those are all really good guesses. But as we get through them, our first one is the Paiute sculpin. Then we have our tui chub, our brown trout, our sunfish, the mountain whitefish, and this one may be kind of a shock, but yeah, like someone just said, the rainbow trout. So if you guys are looking at your own trout, they are really, really small and they can get a lot bigger. But since they're on this slide of fish food, trout will eat other trout. Since they are smaller, they will eat anything they can get their mouth on. So trout are not excluded from the fish food that bigger trout may eat. And you guys might see that as your fish grow a little bit bigger as they get hungry. So make sure to feed them when it's the right time. But we're going to talk about predators of our trout. Predators are our tertiary consumers because they eat our secondary consumers, like our fish or trout or anything below, like frogs and crayfish that we talked about. There are some predators like big cats that could be quaternary consumers because they eat tertiary consumers, and it's that whole food web that we discussed earlier. But for a few predators of our trout, we're going to first get into our avian predators. Avian means birds. So our first bird that we're going to talk about is the osprey. The osprey is a pretty good sized bird. And if you can see the kind of odd way it's carrying that fish, it has this strategy of carrying the fish in line with itself so it can increase the aerodynamics. If you guys don't know what aerodynamics mean, that's okay. It's just reducing the amount of wind that's on the bird's body as it flies. So if you can imagine like running with your hands out or your arms stretched out really wide, you can feel the wind all across your body, right? And that might slow you down a little bit. But if you run with your arms tucked into your body, you won't feel the wind as much and you'll be able to go a lot faster. So that's why the osprey likes to bring the fish in line with itself so it can fly a lot easier. And then next, we have our belted kingfisher. This bird is about the size of a dove, so it's not too big, not like our osprey, but it has this really unique ability to keep its head completely still, even when it's on a branch that could be moving. And it does this so it can keep track of its prey while the fish is moving in the water and while maybe it's even flying around. It just helps it focus on the fish itself. That way it can dive more accurately. And then finally, we have our American pelican. These guys can get really, really big, and they can actually hold about 3 gallons of water inside of their bill, which is a lot. So when they are hunting for fish, they don't need to be as accurate as the kingfisher or the osprey, because they can just scoop the general area around the fish. And since they can hold a lot of water, they can generally get the fish every time since they're also getting the water with it. And if you guys didn't know, Anaho Island on Pyramid Lake is one of the largest breeding grounds of pelicans. So if you guys ever go up to Pyramid Lake, you might see a lot of pelicans there. And then now we're going to move on to our aquatic mammals. If you guys would like to discuss with your class, what do you think makes a mammal a mammal? Like what traits does a mammal have that are unique to mammals itself? And once you guys have your answers, you can put them in the chat and we'll discuss about it. Awesome. So it looks like you guys have hit pretty much every point. The main thing that makes a mammal is their fur or their hair. So this is a trait that is unique to mammals only. If you look at our skin, we have hair on our arms and our legs. We have hair on our head. If you look at the otter here, it has hair as well as the mink. If you look at a fish, they have scales, right? And birds have feathers. So they don't have fur. That's only for our mammals. And then next, you guys also mentioned this, which is awesome. Mammals give birth to live young, and their babies rely on the mothers for food and shelter and protection. This is also unique to mammals because if you look at a bird, they will lay eggs, and the baby bird will hatch. And yes, it still relies on its mother at a young age, but since it hatches from an egg, it's not a mammal. And then if you look at fish, they will hatch from an egg and they don't rely on their parents at all. So that reliant while being young is a mammal thing only. And then you guys also mentioned how babies drink the mother's milk. So mammal mothers produce milk in order to provide for their children, which is also a unique thing for just mammals. And then if you guys kind of look at our otter and our mink, mostly on the otter on the left-hand side, you can see that light coloring on its kind of front side. And when you look at the mink, it has a dark coloring on the top. So that is called counter shading. This is to hide from predators and also hide from prey. That white coloring on the otter, imagine looking up and seeing that white color while in the water as a fish. That white color will kind of blend in with the sun and make it a little bit difficult to see. So they use this as camouflage so they can catch food easier. But with that mink, you see how it's really dark on the top. That's so they can hide from predators that may want to eat them, maybe some of those quaternary consumers. So that dark color fur lets them camouflage on the top of the water so no one sees them on top, so they can still go about catching their prey below. So those are just some unique adaptations our predators have. And you can see that a little bit better here on these images. In reverse, you can see the otter has that dark color on top and the mink has that light color on the bottom. And you can see that coloring a little bit more with the sun above the mink and how it can be a little bit difficult for maybe trout to see those predators from above. Now we're going to move on to our black bears and the kokanee salmon. At Taylor Creek, there are a lot of salmon passing through, usually in October, and the bears love to take advantage of this opportunity. So our trout are passing through Taylor Creek in order to get to their spawning grounds, and they do this every single year. And by the time they reach Taylor Creek, they are exhausted from their journey. And if you guys don't know anything about bears, bears love an easy meal. That's why they're always in the trash. That's why they prefer eating berries or maybe even dead animals that they find. Bears are pretty lazy and they like easy food. So when they see these trout passing through, really tired, they like to just go stand in the water, and it's such an easy meal for them and they absolutely love it. So bears are a big predator of mainly salmon and trout as they pass through the rivers. And yeah, you guys can watch this happen every October, usually around the same time if you're interested, again at Taylor Creek. But obviously, if anyone's going there, remember to stay away from the wildlife. Let the bears eat the fish. We don't need to join them or touch them or scare them, right? Let the animals be. And it's a really cool thing to see. But speaking of humans as predators, not only can we affect wildlife, but we love to eat fish, right? Fishing is a really fun experience, and it'd be great if you guys go out with your family and go fishing. And humans have adapted very well to fish and different types of fish, and we've made it a lot easier on ourselves. So not only do they make great food for us, but again, it's really easy for us to catch it because the bait that we have has begun to mimic trout and other fish food. So it's, again, really easy for us to catch these fish. So that can kind of be a little bit of a threat to fish sometimes if they don't know what's prey and what's bait, right? And it can be kind of confusing for them. Great for us, a little bit confusing for them. But that's why there's lots of different types of lures and all this stuff for mimicking trout prey, which again makes it easy for us. And the fish don't know any better because they like to eat different kind of bugs or smaller fish. But there's some different lures, and you can kind of see how that mimics one of our insects there. And another one of the lures, a spinner. You can kind of see how that also mimics our insects. And the live bait. So using live bait is also really easy. Helps the fish, helps us get the fish, sorry. So that pretty much wraps up our discussion for today. If you guys want to recap, we reviewed what makes a habitat. So the food, the water, the shelter, the space. We learned about food chains, food webs, and trophic pyramids, how energy moves from the bottom to the top from our primary producers to our primary consumers, our secondary consumers, and all the way up to our third and fourth consumers and even more, and how that energy moves and what eats what, right? And then we went over what our trout eat. Trout will eat anything that they can put their mouth on, right? Anything that's smaller than them and they're given the opportunity, they will eat it. And then we discussed what preys on trout. So not only trout themselves, but mammals and larger animals that like to eat fish. So thank you guys for tuning in. We are going to open up the Q&A, and I think Jan is going to take over from here.
Hey guys, thank you very much, Aiden and Sadie. Yeah, we will definitely open it up for questions now. My favorite part of the webinars for sure. If you want, please place those in the Q&A box, and we'll get through as many of those as we can. All right, so I like that question to start. Nice and comfortable with that one. So, question is, what's a good place to fish? In my opinion, the best place to fish, as far as just about guaranteed success, is going to be one of our community ponds. So here in Reno, we have quite a few. The biggest one being the Sparks Marina, which isn't always the best place to fish, but certainly one of the waters that we plant or we stock quite a bit with trout. Some others would be the top of the list would be like Maryland's Pond over off Mount Rose Highway. Um, there are quite a few others, including Rancho San Rafael Pond, the Paradise Ponds, the Verdi Mill Ponds. There are quite a few pieces of water that are considered our community ponds, which are planted with trout very regularly. So typically spring, summer, and fall. Some others close by would be Bailey Pond down in Carson City, Seaman Pond down in the Gardnerville and Minden area, as well as Mitch Park Pond. So really, those community ponds are definitely set up for success. So good fishing just about any time, spring to fall. Next one there. Good question. Do trout eat plants? Yes, they absolutely will. It's not the top choice, for sure. But they absolutely will if there's not much else to eat. We've had trout in some of our aquariums that when not fed regularly enough, will actually take the gravel, the rocks up off the ground, kind of move them around their mouth, which actually dislodges the algae that was on the rocks and then spit the rocks back out for something. So definitely not the top choice, but they absolutely will. A lot of times they kind of can't help but eat too because a lot of their the food source that they definitely need those macroinvertebrate and aquatic insects are living in plants. So a lot of times we'll have them we'll have uh, stomach samples have both the insects and some plants in them as well, and it's just because they're kind of taking in everything off of those plants, including some of the plants. Next one, why do trout eat other trout? Um, so, most animals will eat just about anything that fits in their mouth. So I guess the answer to that one isn't a good one, but because they can. They are animals, and a lot of times animals will eat anything they can, plants, other trout, whatever it may be. So uh, if they're hungry enough, they'll eat just about anything. Next one here, when a trout hatches, will it go immediately for its neighboring or fellow eggs? So typically they're not big enough after hatching to go for other eggs, but a little bit further along in life, once they get to kind of that fingerling stage, they will absolutely start to eat eggs. So for example, if you've got uh, rainbow trout, excuse me, hatching in the springtime, and we have our brown trout typically hatching in the fall or spawning in the fall. Those rainbow trout from the spring spawn will absolutely, uh, they have no problem eating those brown trout eggs later in the fall. So they definitely will, but typically when they're real small, they won't. Especially when they're that elven stage, they kind of have that food source or that nutrients source in the egg for quite a while. one that kind of goes with that one. Will trout ever eat their own eggs? Yes. Sometimes they will. Uh, Sometimes they will. It's kind of interesting keeping tropical fish for a long period of time. It's kind of the same thing. A lot of times, if they don't feel like their eggs are protected. Sometimes they will eat them. So when they're spawning, if they have some disruption and they have another fish come in and try to kind of disturb things, they will absolutely kind of gobble up things. And I'm not sure it's not really for a food. I think it's more for protection and kind of um, more instinct and less looking for that kind of that food source. But um, I would have to imagine if they were hungry enough, they would as well. But that is probably less likely. Are there rainbow trout in the Truckee River? There are absolutely rainbow trout in the Truckee River. The Truckee River has rainbow trout, cut bow or bow cut trout, which is a hybrid between a rainbow and a cutthroat. There are also Lahontan cutthroat trout in the Truckee, as well as brown trout. And we've got some green sunfish, there are some bass lower in the river, not a ton down there with quite a few carp. So we have a pretty good spread of game fish or target fish in the Truckee. Let's see, what lakes are good for fishing? So going to some bigger water outside of our community ponds. One lake that's fishing very well right now. It's not managed by us, so you actually need a separate fishing license to fish. But Pyramid Lake has been pretty incredible this year. Some other lakes close by, close, I guess, maybe not that close, but going up north out of Gerlach, we have Squaw Creek Reservoir as well as Wall Canyon Reservoir for trout. If you um, are into fishing for bass or some of our warm water species. So trout are cold water. We have them all in, 50 degrees in our aquariums. But there are other places to fish that have good warm water populations. So bass and walleye and carp and a lot of other species. You can find those at Lahontan. So that's pretty close by, about an hour from Reno, as well as we have Rye Patch out there. There's definitely some good fishing for those warm water species in the lakes, in addition to those northern Washoe County lakes for trout. Do seagulls eat trout? They definitely eat small trout. Absolutely. They are fish eaters and will absolutely gobble up our fry or even fingerlings at some point if they find them. Why do our trout like dark habitat? So the darkness that we have, or the covers that we have on our tanks to keep them in the dark, um, uh, definitely help. First and foremost, help keep any type of bacteria or algae or any type of growth that could happen on our eggs. So anything that can kill our eggs. So that's kind of the main purpose for our darkness. However, uh, dark is the best form of cover for our trout. So escaping predators is it. And so that's just kind of built in an instinct where fish are going to go under rocks, they're going to go into shady places. I have to imagine that our alvin are much more comfortable in a dark tank opposed to kind of out in the open. I feel like that's kind of evident when we take the covers off. A lot of times they'll be sitting in one space, and as soon as that light hits them, they just kind of go bonkers and they go everywhere. So it's definitely I feel like it's instinct for them to want to stay in dark areas because it's such a good form of cover. Let's see, next one here. Do they make their own shelter? Um, so um, Not ordinarily. They're relying on natural shelter, natural cover, whether it's in the form of under a or behind a big rock or in a shady area or in a deep hole in the river where they can't be seen by predators from above. A lot of times they're relying on and moving within like the Truckee River to find shelter. Um, they're I heard and I probably should confirm this before I share it, but up on Sage Hen Creek, just into California, just over into California from us, um, there was a study on the brown trout that would actually kind of bury themselves. So in a sense, I think that's kind of like a shelter. When the water would get so low that they struggled to escape predators, they would actually find a way to kind of create their own shelter. So, without being able to confirm that, I wouldn't say that's absolutely correct, but I did hear that somewhere in my journey, somewhere along the way, that they do actually do that. So, I would say no, possibly to that one. How long have trout been in Nevada? Great question. A really long time. Um, uh, the the ancient lake, so Lake Mahonton, um, which took up most of the Great Basin, was home to our Lahontan cutthroat trout. They have been around a lot longer than the state of Nevada has been around. They've been around for a long time. Um, that's a great question. Next one here, I see. Will Alvin attack Fry? They shouldn't. I feel like Al when they're in the Alvin stage, they're still absorbing that egg sac. They're pretty vulnerable. They, I feel like they've kind of got a one-track mind, and that's just kind of not be seen, hide, staying undercover. So they're not quite, they're not thinking about anything other than staying alive. They don't have to quite start thinking about food yet. So the only reason I would see them actually attacking or going after something is once they've kind of moved beyond that alvin stage. So once they've fully absorbed their egg sac. And a lot of times we can tell that because once we start feeding our fry, in a week or two from now, once those alvin have absorbed all the egg sacs and they start looking for food, we'll have a mix of alvin and some fry um, in our tanks. A lot of times you'll see the fry eating, but the alvin still are just not interested in eating whatsoever. How fast can a grown trout swim? Um, Great question. I think we actually may have answered that one in the first presentation as well. And the answer that I had is, I believe, about 20 feet per second. So they have the ability to really swim quick. So predator from above scares them or spooks them. They quick burst of energy and they're upriver really quick. Definitely fast. I don't know what that is miles per hour, but I think about 20 feet per second is pretty huge. Um, Maybe not over a long period, but as far as a short burst, they can get out of the way quick. Next one here, how long would they have the yolk sac? I feel like 2 weeks is a pretty good answer to that one. A lot of it is going to vary slightly dependent on water temperatures, but for the most part, it's about 2 weeks, and it it's definitely there to keep them alive for a while. So we won't want to start feeding our trout until we completely see those gone. Let's see. All kinds of questions. I love it, guys. Great. Um, How long will they live after laying eggs? Trout are not like salmon, where a lot of our salmon, including like the kokanee salmon out of Lake Tahoe, moving into like Taylor Creek and some of the tributaries for Tahoe, those fish will die after they lay eggs. We have going to Tahoe, we have uh, two creeks that we collect eggs out of, both Third Creek and Incline Creek. We will set traps more or less for these trout that are coming into the creeks out of the lake to spawn. And when they move into those creeks, we'll trap them in either shock them and catch them and move them into holding pens, or have actually pens that they will get trapped in. And we have had some fish, because we're always keeping track. We actually have a scannable chip in fish, and we're able to see that fish return, 2, 3, 4, even 5 and 6 years. So they'll come back for 6 years, and spawn over and over and over again. And when you think about numbers, that means some of our trout can produce, upwards of, 50,000 eggs in their lifetime. So they will continue to reproduce over and over again, until they die from something else. But spawning and laying eggs won't isn't the end of them. Do trout eat dead fish? Um, I would say definitely. Uh, there's there is a fly pattern called a flesh fly, and it's kind of gross. But for example, Alaska, they fish a fly pattern or a lure that imitates dead and rotting flesh of the salmon. So we talked briefly about salmon dying after they reproduce. So salmon, it's kind of a for the most part, it's a kind of a one shot. So they spawn, they go from the ocean into a river, they spawn, and then they die after spawning. And There are definitely trout that are eager to eat those pieces or parts of those dying salmon. So there's a fly again, typically more so used in Alaska, but it looks like a chunk of rotting flesh, and it catches a lot of really large trout. So it's made to look like rotting salmon flesh or skin or meat, and they definitely eat it. Sorry if I'm skipping over some of them here, but how long can a trout live without food? There's definitely uh, they can go to quite a while. Some of our fish that we have, is I'm not going to call them pets, but the fish that we have in some of our tanks at our offices, as well as up in Verdi at the library there, we end up getting them on a feeding schedule. So once they get to be a little bit bigger, so when they're kind of full size or adult size, our trout can go a week, in some cases even 2 weeks without eating. That's not the case with the smaller fish. The fry fingerling and juvenile trout absolutely need to eat, daily. So their calorie intake has to be daily, whereas once they get to be quite a bit bigger, Some of the largest trout in the Truckee River probably eat once a week. So, a 6, 7, 8 pound trout will swim out from its deep dark hole, eat like a 14-inch or a 16-inch trout or whitefish or other fish in the river, and then return to kind of their deep dark hole and um, will not need to eat again for a few more days, not feel like eating for a few more days, as they kind of digest that big meal. So, shorter period of time when they're smaller, longer period, or they can wait much longer to eat once they get to be a little bit bigger. How long can trout survive without oxygen? I feel like this great example for this is hold your breath. So they can hold their breath for about as long as we can. So after a minute without oxygen, they're probably 50-50 whether or not they're gonna be able to survive it. Going up 2, 3, 4 minutes without any oxygen, I would say that's probably about the max. So again, a good example is how long can you hold your breath? That's about how long they can. I feel like the next one there, how long can a trout live without water is about the same. Kind of the same answer, I think, is the oxygen one because they're getting their oxygen out of the water. It's about as long as they can hold their breath, so a couple of minutes. Next one here. How long can a trout live in 70-degree water? Um, so because, and this almost goes with that last question, the last answer, as the water warms up, the oxygen content really goes down. So 70-degree water is kind of when it starts to get 70, 75. That's when you definitely start um, uh, seeing the loss of more trout when it comes to like our fisheries. So you they can handle short periods of it, but definitely can't handle long, wouldn't be able to survive forever in 70 or 75-degree water. So they can handle it for short periods. A lot of times, water warms up and there's more parasites in those waters. So there's a lot of things that come with that warmer water. Um, so they can, but not for a long extended period. Even in the summertime when the Truckee River heats up, it really is only warm when the sun is out. So when the sun sets, the water temperature typically goes down, any 8, 10, 12 degrees in the river. So there's a fluctuation there. So if it's 70, 75 degrees during the day, kind of the night to the early morning, they get a break from that 70-degree temperature, and the water drastically is much, much cooler. Next one here, how many trout, how many types of trout are in Nevada? So we have quite a few. If you include our hybrids, we have about 10 to 12. So we have our five native, tiger trout, cut bobo, cut brook trout, as well as uh, brown trout. They're not native. So about 10 to 12 different types in the state. Um, yeah, I hope that answers that. Let's see. Are there trout on the East Coast? Most definitely. We've moved a lot of fish around, so the brook trout is a perfect example of that. Brook trout are not native to the West Coast. They came from the East Coast. So they originated there, and at some point in time, they were brought over to the West Coast. So there are absolutely trout on the East Coast. They also have some others that you will find on the East, and not on the West. Is there's the Atlantic salmon. There are um, There are some that do better on the East Coast than the West Coast, so that might separate some of them. But there's absolutely, definitely trout on the East Coast. They have brown trout. Brown trout are not native to either coast, and we have brown trout on both coasts. So there's definitely trout on the East Coast. There's a good one. So, do fish sleep? Might have to refer back to our helpers here for this one for some help with this one, but they can't close their eyes, so they're kind of always aware, I think, to some degree of what's going on around them. I can tell you, like our trout that we have in our offices, they go into kind of a dormant phase where they I think dormant would be about the best way to explain it. They're not interested in eating. When it gets dark, they kind of shut down. Um, the Oh, I'm getting some help with this answer right now. So I say no, they can't actually sleep, but I might be wrong on that one. See what we come up with here. All right, well, Google tells me that trout do sleep. However, it's kind of exactly what I was explaining. They don't do it the same way as humans do because they can't close their eyes. They kind of go into a dormant phase. So their metabolism reduces and they stop worrying about predators, prey. They stop worrying about eating or being eaten, and kind of shut down. So I'm not sure I would call that sleep, but Google tells me it's sleep. I would say that yes, they kind of can. It's not a real good answer, but there it is. So sorry, I missed this one, and this is a good one. I missed quite a few here. Circle back, sorry, out of order here, but have any other trout been brought back from extinction other than Lahontan cutthroat trout? So I guess kind of depends on how you look at that. So the Lahontan cutthroat was thought to be extinct, at least the form that we had in Pyramid Lake. And they have since found that one alive, or did find that one alive, out over on the Utah border, uh, just outside of Pilot Peak. So the strain that that I think we're talking about would be the Pilot Peak cutthroat trout, or Pilot Peak Lahontan cutthroat trout, which is the one that existed initially in Pyramid, and they know that from doing some DNA samples on some very, very old fish, or old mounts. they did have a viable sample to be able to confirm that that fish that was moved over to that small creek off of Pilot Peak back into Pyramid, and that's kind of how we had that reintroduction of the Lahontan cutthroat. So I don't think any have been brought back from extinction. We were just lucky enough to be able to find that one that had been moved to another place. Another one here. How big can the trout get? I love that one. I feel like we get that one pretty regularly. Our fish can live to be, on the old side, 8 or 10 years old. Most of them are kind of in that 6 to 7. And depending on the conditions, if everything is prime, water quality, we have a good food source, everything is kind of in their favor. Our rainbow trout, I think the state record is about 16 pounds. So much larger than a human baby when born. 16 pounds is about twice the size of a big baby. So I would have to imagine that length for a 16-pound fish would be probably 34 inches. So quite big, definitely quite big. Others can be quite a bit bigger. Are specifically talking about the Lahontan cutthroat trout, the fish that was brought back and reintroduced, the Pilot Peak strain from Pilot Peak or the creek on the Utah border. That fish gets very, very large in Pyramid Lake. So all conditions are right, and we're seeing fish that are up near 30 pounds. So twice as big as that rainbow trout record that we have. So they are regularly catching fish over 20 pounds out at Pyramid right now. So they can get big when they have everything kind of in their favor. Oh, this one's fun. So, do trout blink? They do not. They do not. They don't have eyelids, so they are not able to sleep or blink. Well, my idea of sleep. When I go to sleep, I dream, and they definitely, I don't think, do much dreaming. How long is the journey they take to spawn? This is a fun question. So we have some of our sea run species. So the steelhead trout, perfect example. They will swim across 3 states before they spawn. So hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles they'll swim before they spawn. So our trout tend to move definitely less than that. They don't go quite as far as our steelhead. But like our cutthroat trout out of Pyramid have been found up near Reno. So naturally trying to reproduce 20 miles away or 15 miles away. So they'll definitely do some moving. Our resident rainbow trouts, like the fish that we're raising right now, won't go that far. So, a mile I feel like would be a long trek for them. Um, it's less important for them to move upstream, more important for them to find good habitat or good substrate or stream bottom for them to reproduce in. They need, just like we have our eggs in kind of that fine gravel, um, uh, rainbow trout kind of out like in the Truckee are looking for that same substrate or that same river bottom. They're able to kind of dig a spot where they can make a protected area for the fish. So that was a great question. Another fun question. Can trout live beneath water that has been frozen on top? Absolutely. So They are able to survive and breathe because of the plants in the water. So the only thing that will kill a trout under like a frozen lake is when the lake freezes and we get so much snow and so much cover over the top of the lake that it actually kills the vegetation in the lake. So they are able to survive through those the aquatic vegetation and photosynthesis with those aquatic plants. Believe it or not, it's pretty amazing. However, we do lose some of our higher fisheries because it's just too much, and it ends up the frozen the ice and then the snow on top cuts out all the light, and that will kill our fish, our trout specifically under frozen lakes. But they absolutely can go, 3, 4, 5 months under a frozen, thick frozen layer. I think a good example of that would be like Marlette Lake or Spooner Lake up by Lake Tahoe. They both freeze very, very, very solid every single year. And trout have no problem with it. That colder water, their metabolism slows. So they don't have to eat as much. They do a lot less. They tend to be smaller too, when they're under ice for long periods of time, just because um, uh, they their metabolism slows. So they are dormant kind of that a big portion of the year. Can trout live in the ocean? So our trout, no, they cannot breathe in salt water. There are sea run species like the steelhead that absolutely can. Our trout is kind of a rainbow trout is kind of the landlocked version of the steelhead. But if we were to take our trout and try to put them in the ocean, they would not be able to survive. Even a pyramid's kind of a good example of that. And our Lahontan cutthroat trout have kind of adapted to the higher salt content or alkalinity in the water. They have tried in the past to put rainbow trout into Pyramid Lake, and they were not able to survive. So even looking at maybe not as high as a salt content as the ocean, but as Pyramid, they can't handle it. They just can't breathe. Great questions, guys. Take a couple more here, so we don't end up going all day. But can other species of trout live in warmer water? I think a fun answer for that one is some trout can handle warmer water than others. So like our brown trout, and in some cases, short periods, brook trout can handle warmer water than like our rainbow trout or our cutthroat trout. So some can handle warmer water for that kind of that short period of time, but you wouldn't find trout in water that's always, 75 or 80 degrees. They just couldn't survive. But again, the short periods, they definitely can handle it, but not for long periods. All right. I think that it's probably going to wrap it up for the day. Um, Appreciate everybody participating and being here. Looks like we're only down to a few people. Um, Thank you. Appreciate all the great questions. And thank you, Aiden and Sadie, for fantastic presentation. We will see you guys next week.